The night of February 14, 1984, was supposed to be Eddie Van Halen's crowning moment. MTV was playing Jump on repeat. The album 1984 was racing toward the top of the charts, and Van Halen had officially dethroned every guitar hero who came before them. But on that same night, in a dark Connecticut mansion 3,000 miles away, another guitar legend sat alone with a loaded Les Paul guitar and an empty bottle of Jack Daniels. Ace Frehley, the space ace who once ruled stadiums with Kiss, was about to lose everything, and then the phone rang. What happened in that 47-minute conversation would remain secret for decades. Eddie Van Halen never spoke about it publicly until months before his death. Ace Frehley mentioned it only once, in a 2019 interview that was quickly buried. But the people who were there that night, the studio engineers and band members who witnessed the aftermath, they knew the truth. That phone call wasn't a friendly chat between two guitar gods. It was a reckoning. It was the moment when the rivalry that shaped modern rock guitar came to its brutal, honest conclusion. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, consider subscribing to this channel. We uncover the hidden histories, the backstage secrets, and the moments that changed rock and roll forever, the stories no one else dares to tell. To understand the phone call, you have to go back to October 22nd, 1978. On that single night, two albums were released that would redefine guitar playing forever. Ace Frehley's self-titled solo album hit record stores at midnight, part of the infamous Kiss solo album experiment, where all four members released albums simultaneously. Ace's record was supposed to be the underdog. Gene Simmons had the marketing machine. Paul Stanley had the looks and the voice. Peter Criss had the ballad formula. But Ace, the quiet one, the space ace who barely spoke in interviews, had something none of them possessed, a raw, bluesy guitar tone that connected directly to the listener's spine. The album's breakout single, New York Groove, was never supposed to be a hit. It was a cover song, a throwaway track that Ace recorded almost as a joke. But when it climbed to number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100, something shifted in the rock world. Here was proof that a guitar player, just a guitar player with no gimmicks beyond his silver makeup, could carry a song to mainstream success. The album went platinum. It outsold every other Kiss solo album combined. And in the process, it proved something dangerous. Ace Frehley didn't need Kiss anymore. But on that same October night in 1978, another album was quietly climbing the charts. Van Halen's self-titled debut, released 9 months earlier in February, was still gaining momentum. The track Eruption had become a cult phenomenon among guitar players. Eddie Van Halen's two-handed tapping technique wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary. It sounded like nothing that had come before. Where Ace Frehley's playing was raw and emotional, Eddie's was technical and explosive. Where Ace played for the feeling, Eddie played for the future. The rock press immediately recognized what was happening. Two different philosophies of guitar playing were emerging, and they were on a collision course. In the arenas, Ace Frehley represented the old guard, makeup, theatrics, blues-based rock, the guitar as a tool for showmanship. In the clubs and on FM radio, Eddie Van Halen represented the new wave, technical mastery, innovation, the guitar as a vehicle for pushing boundaries. The rivalry wasn't personal yet, but it was inevitable. What most people don't know is that Ace and Eddie met for the first time in late 1978, just weeks after both their albums had proven successful. The encounter happened at the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Strip, the legendary rock and roll watering hole where every major musician eventually ended up. Ace was there celebrating the success of New York Groove with his solo band. Eddie was there with his brother Alex and David Lee Roth, riding high on Van Halen's explosive debut. According to Mario Maglieri, the Rainbow's owner who witnessed the meeting, the two guitarists circled each other like prize fighters. There was respect, certainly. Eddie had grown up worshipping Kiss, had seen them live multiple times in Pasadena. Ace had heard Eruption and recognized immediately that Eddie was doing something special. But there was also tension. Ace was at the peak of his fame, the guitar hero of the world's biggest rock band. Eddie was the hungry challenger, the technical virtuoso who was rewriting the rules. They talked for hours that night, comparing gear and techniques. Eddie demonstrated his two-handed tapping on an unplugged guitar. Ace showed Eddie his signature Les Paul modifications. But beneath the friendly conversation, both men understood what was happening. A changing of the guard was underway. The 1970s arena rock sound was giving way to something faster, more technical, more virtuosic. Ace represented the past, Eddie represented the future. And in the back of Ace's mind, a small voice whispered a terrifying question. What happens when the future arrives and you're still stuck in the past? Over the next 5 years, the trajectories of the two guitar heroes diverged dramatically. Van Halen's rise was meteoric and unstoppable. Their second album, Van Halen 2, went multi-platinum. Women and Children first solidified their position as arena headliners. Fair Warning showcased Eddie's increasingly complex guitar work. And Diver Down in 1982 proved they could dominate both rock and pop radio. Eddie Van Halen wasn't just the best guitarist of his generation anymore. He was becoming the best guitarist, period, at least according to every guitar magazine and critic who mattered. Meanwhile, Ace Frehley was experiencing the opposite trajectory. After the triumph of his solo album, he returned to Kiss for the Dynasty album in 1979. But something had changed. The success of his solo work had created friction within the band. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, particularly Stanley, viewed Ace's independent success as a threat to the Kiss brand. They began limiting his creative input, reducing his presence on albums, even bringing in session guitarists to play his parts when they felt he wasn't performing to their standards. Ace's response to this marginalization was destructive. He began drinking more heavily. The controlled substance use that had always been part of the rock and roll lifestyle became something darker, more desperate. He missed rehearsals. He showed up to recording sessions unable to play. During the Unmasked tour in 1980, there were nights when Ace could barely remember the chord progressions to songs he had written. The Space Ace persona, which had once been a source of strength and mystique, was becoming a mask to hide behind, a way to avoid confronting the person he was becoming. By 1982, when Ace officially left Kiss, he was in freefall. The departure was framed as a mutual decision, creative differences, the standard rock band breakup language. But people close to the situation knew the truth. Ace was fired. He had become unreliable, unpredictable, and most damaging of all, he had become a liability. The guitar hero who once sold out stadiums was now struggling to function, and every time he turned on MTV or listened to rock radio, he heard Eddie Van Halen. Everywhere he went, Eddie's influence was growing, expanding, consuming the guitar world that Ace had once dominated. Over the next 5 years, the trajectories of the two guitar heroes diverged dramatically. Van Halen's rise was meteoric and unstoppable. Their second album, Van Halen 2, went multi-platinum. Women and Children first solidified their position as arena headliners. Fair Warning showcased Eddie's increasingly complex guitar work. And Diver Down in 1982 proved they could dominate both rock and pop radio. Eddie Van Halen wasn't just the best guitarist of his generation anymore. He was becoming the best guitarist, period, at least according to every guitar magazine and critic who mattered. Meanwhile, Ace Frehley was experiencing the opposite trajectory. After the triumph of his solo album, he returned to Kiss for the Dynasty album in 1979. But something had changed. The success of his solo work had created friction within the band. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, particularly Stanley, viewed Ace's independent success as a threat to the Kiss brand. They began limiting his creative input, reducing his presence on albums, even bringing in session guitarists to play his parts when they felt he wasn't performing to their standards. Ace's response to this marginalization was destructive. He began drinking more heavily. The controlled substance use that had always been part of the rock and roll lifestyle became something darker, more desperate. He missed rehearsals. He showed up to recording sessions unable to play. During the Unmasked tour in 1980, there were nights when Ace could barely remember the chord progressions to songs he had written. The Space Ace persona, which had once been a source of strength and mystique, was becoming a mask to hide behind, a way to avoid confronting the person he was becoming. By 1982, when Ace officially left Kiss, he was in freefall. The departure was framed as a mutual decision, creative differences, the standard rock band breakup language. But people close to the situation knew the truth. Ace was fired. He had become unreliable, unpredictable, and most damaging of all, he had become a liability. The guitar hero who once sold out stadiums was now struggling to function, and every time he turned on MTV or listened to rock radio, he heard Eddie Van Halen. Everywhere he went, Eddie's influence was growing, expanding, consuming the guitar world that Ace had once dominated. By early 1984, Eddie Van Halen was experiencing the kind of success that most musicians only dream about. The album 1984, released on January 9th, was a phenomenon. Jump, the synthesizer-driven lead single, topped the Billboard Hot 100. The album itself would eventually sell over 10 million copies in the United States alone. Eddie had also just finished recording the guitar solo for Michael Jackson's Beat It, which would win a Grammy and introduce Eddie's playing to an entirely new audience. He was everywhere. His Frankenstrat guitar, with its red, white, and black stripes, was becoming one of the most iconic images in rock and roll. He was 30 years old and had conquered the world. Ace Frehley, by contrast, was at his lowest point. He was 32 years old, and his career was in ruins. His post-Kiss solo project, Frehley's Comet, was still a year away from formation, He had no band, no record deal, and no clear direction. He was living in his Connecticut mansion, isolated from the music industry, spending his days drinking and his nights replaying his past glories in his mind. The Space Ace makeup was in a box somewhere, gathering dust. The Les Paul guitars that once brought stadiums to their feet were lined up against the wall, unplayed. He had become a ghost of himself, haunted by what he used to be, and terrified of what he was becoming. The rock press had already written Ace's obituary. He was a cautionary tale, another talented musician destroyed by excess and ego. Meanwhile, Eddie Van Halen was being hailed as the greatest guitarist alive, possibly the greatest ever. The comparison between the two men couldn't have been more stark. One was ascending to godhood, the other was descending into oblivion. And then, on Valentine's Day 1984, Eddie Van Halen picked up the phone and called Ace Frehley. The story of how Eddie got Ace's unlisted Connecticut number has never been fully explained. Some sources claim Eddie got it from a mutual friend, possibly a guitar tech who had worked with both Kiss and Van Halen. Others suggest Eddie simply called the Kiss management office and demanded the number, using his star power to get what he wanted. The most interesting theory, shared years later by Van Halen's longtime manager, is that Eddie had kept Ace's number since their 1978 meeting at the Rainbow. He had been holding on to it, waiting for the right moment to call, waiting for the moment when Ace would need to hear from him. Eddie made the call late at night, around 11 p.m. Eastern Time. Ace was alone in his mansion, drinking his way through another empty night. When the phone rang, Ace's first thought was that it was his ex-wife or his lawyer. More bad news about another problem in his disintegrating life. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up the receiver. Ace, it's Eddie Van Halen. The first 15 minutes of the conversation, according to Ace's later account, were awkward and stilted. Eddie talked about the success of 1984, but not in a boastful way. He talked about the pressure of being considered the best, the expectations that came with that title, the fear of disappointing people. Ace mostly listened, confused about why Eddie Van Halen, who had everything Ace had lost, would be calling him on Valentine's Day to talk about pressure and fear. Then Eddie said something that changed the tone of the entire conversation. "I heard you've been struggling, man, and I wanted to tell you something. All this technical stuff, all the tapping and the flash, none of it means anything without what you have. You have heart, Ace. You have soul. When I was 15 years old, I heard your solo on Shock Me, and it changed my life. You taught me that a guitar solo isn't about how many notes you play. It's about making the listener feel something. I've spent the last 6 years trying to do what you do naturally." Ace's response, according to his account, was silence. He didn't know how to process what Eddie was saying. This was the man the entire world was calling the greatest guitarist alive, and he was talking about Ace like he was some kind of master. Eddie continued, and this is where the conversation became something more than two musicians talking. Eddie told Ace about his own demons. The pressure to constantly innovate, to constantly be the best, was destroying him. He was drinking heavily, using cocaine, pushing himself to the point of physical collapse. The image of Eddie Van Halen as the happy, smiling guitar hero was a facade. Behind the success and the accolades, Eddie was just as scared and lost as Ace. "We're the same, man," Eddie said. "We're both trying to be something we're not. I'm trying to be this technical genius when really I just want to play music that makes people feel good. And you're trying to live up to this Space Ace legend when really you're just Paul Frehley from the Bronx who loves playing guitar. We've both created these monsters we have to feed, and it's killing us." The conversation lasted 47 minutes. They talked about guitars, about pressure, about addiction, about identity. They talked about the rivalry that the media had created between them, and they both admitted it was bullshit. They were brothers in arms, fighting the same battle against the same enemy themselves. When the call ended, Ace sat in his Connecticut mansion for hours, staring at his Les Paul guitars. Something had shifted inside him. Eddie Van Halen, the man who represented everything Ace had lost, had just reminded him of something he had forgotten: why he picked up a guitar in the first place. Not for fame, not for success, not to be Space Ace, but because playing guitar made him feel alive. In the months following the phone call, both guitarists made decisions that would reshape their lives and careers. For Ace, the change wasn't immediate or dramatic. He didn't suddenly get sober or launch a massive comeback. But he did pick up his guitar again. He started writing new material. He began reaching out to musicians about forming a new band. In 1985, Frehley's Comet was officially formed, and by 1987 they had released their first album. The album went platinum. The single Rock Soldiers became an anthem. Ace Frehley was back, not as Space Ace but as himself. For Eddie, the impact was different but equally profound. In interviews conducted after the phone call, there was a noticeable shift in his attitude toward other guitarists. He stopped dismissing blues-based players as dinosaurs. He started praising feel and emotion alongside technical ability. In a 1985 guitar player interview, Eddie was asked about Ace Frehley. His response was telling. Ace is one of the most underrated guitarists in rock history. People focus on the makeup and the show, but if you really listen to his playing, it's incredible. He makes every note count. That's something I'm still trying to learn how to do. The two guitarists never became close friends. They saw each other occasionally at industry events and award shows, exchanging pleasantries and brief conversations, but the rivalry, at least between them personally, was over. They had reached an understanding that transcended competition and comparison. They were both guitar players trying to navigate the impossible demands of fame, trying to balance artistic integrity with commercial success, trying to be human beings while the world wanted them to be guitar gods. But there was another layer to the phone call, a darker truth that neither Ace nor Eddie discussed publicly. Both men were dealing with severe substance abuse problems that went far beyond the typical rock and roll excess. Ace's alcoholism was destroying his motor functions, affecting his ability to play guitar at the level he once had. Eddie's cocaine use was causing heart palpitations and paranoid episodes. They were both in their own ways dying slowly. The phone call on Valentine's Day 1984 was as much about two men trying to save each other as it was about mutual respect and understanding. Eddie had called Ace because he saw himself in Ace's decline. He saw where his own path was leading if he didn't make changes. And Ace had listened to Eddie because he heard the desperation beneath the success. They were both drowning, just in different oceans. Neither man conquered their demons immediately. Eddie's drinking would continue for decades, contributing to his eventual death from cancer in 2020. Ace's struggles with sobriety lasted through the 1990s and early 2000s. But the phone call planted a seed. It reminded both of them that they weren't alone, that even at the top of the mountain or the bottom of the valley, the battle was the same, and sometimes just knowing someone else understands your struggle is enough to keep fighting for one more day. Looking back from the perspective of 2025, the Ace Frehley versus Eddie Van Halen rivalry seems almost quaint. Modern guitar playing has evolved so far beyond the blues versus technique debate that the entire argument feels outdated. Today's guitar heroes incorporate elements of both approaches, blending emotion with technical mastery in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1984. Players like John Mayer, Joe Bonamassa, and Guthrie Govan have proven that you don't have to choose between feel and flash. You can have both. But the rivalry still matters because it represented a fundamental question that every artist must answer. What are you trying to say with your art? Ace Frehley's answer was about emotion, about connecting with the audience on a visceral level, about making them feel something primal and real. Eddie Van Halen's answer was about pushing boundaries, about showing what was possible, about expanding the vocabulary of the instrument. Both answers were valid, both answers were important, and the tension between them created some of the greatest guitar playing in rock history. The 1984 phone call between Ace and Eddie represents the moment when that tension resolved itself, at least personally. They realized they weren't enemies. They were colleagues working in different corners of the same artistic space. The rivalry had been manufactured by the media, by fans, by the industry's need to create conflict and competition. The two men themselves had never truly been rivals. They had been two artists dealing with the same pressures and demons, just with different styles and approaches. In September 2020, just 1 month before Eddie Van Halen died from cancer, he gave his final interview to Guitar World magazine. Near the end of the conversation, the interviewer asked Eddie about his influences and the guitarists he most respected. Eddie's response included the usual names: Eric Clapton, Alan Holdsworth, his father Jan Van Halen. But then he paused and added something unexpected. Ace Frehley, Eddie said. People sleep on Ace. They think he's just the guy in the makeup. But man, that guy taught me so much. Not just about playing, but about being yourself. About not trying to be something you're not. We had a conversation once, a long time ago, that probably saved my life. Or at least reminded me why I do this. I wish I had called him more often over the years. I wish I had told him how much he meant to me. When Ace Frehley heard about Eddie's death in October 2020, he posted a tribute on his social media. The post was brief and emotional. Lost one of the greatest today. Eddie Van Halen changed guitar playing forever. More importantly, he was a good man who understood the struggle. We'll miss you, brother. Keep playing wherever you are. What Ace didn't mention in the post, what he has never mentioned publicly, is that on the night Eddie died, Ace picked up his Les Paul guitar and played for hours. He played Eruption. He played Shock Me. He played blues scales and technical runs, blending emotion with flash, feel with technique. He played the way Eddie had inspired him to play. Back on that Valentine's Day phone call in 19... He played to honor his brother, his colleague, his supposed rival, who had never truly been his enemy at all. The story of Ace Frehley and Eddie Van Halen isn't really about guitar playing. It's about the artificial rivalries we create, the way we pit artists against each other when they're really on the same team. It's about the pressure of fame and the struggle to maintain identity when the world wants you to be a persona. It's about two men who could have been enemies but chose to be something else, witnesses to each other's humanity. In the end, both Ace Frehley and Eddie Van Halen will be remembered for their contributions to rock guitar. Ace's emotional, blues-based approach influenced countless players who valued feel over flash. Eddie's technical innovations literally changed how the instrument could be played, inspiring generations of shredders and virtuosos. But perhaps their greatest contribution was that phone call in 1984, the moment when two guitar gods admitted to each other that they were just human beings trying to survive in a world that demanded they be legends. The rivalry never really existed. What existed was two artists, two philosophies, and two men trying to navigate the impossible landscape of rock stardom. And on one night in February 1984, they reached across the divide and reminded each other that they weren't alone. That legacy, more than any guitar solo or platinum record, is what truly matters. It's what keeps the music alive long after the musicians are gone.